Welcome to Just One Q. I'm Dr. Melissa Horne, a diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate. In this podcast, I chat with industry experts and thought leaders about the latest trends related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Each episode, I ask just one question tied to current events. And the goal is to leave you with the tools that you need to drive change in your own life, both personally and professionally. Over the past few years, we've grown accustomed to the phrase diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. In fact, this phrase or the acronym has become so ubiquitous as to make it seem like diversity, equity, inclusion are synonymous. But the fact is that diversity, equity, and inclusion are three separate but interconnected concepts, each with their own nuance. And while many organizations get the diversity and inclusion piece, many are still unsure of what equity is or what it looks like in practice within an organization. So today I really want to focus in on equity. It's often the missing and misunderstood piece of so many organizational initiatives. Or, as my guest today describes it, equity is the middle child in DEI. And so for today's question, I'm asking, why is equity the middle child in DEI? How did we get here and how do we sort of move forward? And so to answer today's question, joining me today is Minal Bopaiah. Minal is the author and strategic consultant with nearly 20 years of professional experience. Her areas of expertise include human-centered design, behavioral change, psychology, and the principles of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, or IDEA, as they relate to media, marketing, and communications. As the founder and principal consultant of Brevity Wit, Minal is passionate about designing for equity. Her first book, Equity: How to Design Organizations Where Everyone Thrives, was hailed as a succinct jewel by Nobel Peace Prize laureate Jody Williams. Minal, thank you so much for being here. And that's a pretty cool line on the bio to have.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you for having me. And yes, it is.
So, I kind of stole your line in the intro there, and I know that you've said that equity is the middle child of DEI, and I just want you to sort of expand on that for us. Like, how'd that happen? What does that mean, and where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of just skip over the equity part and pay all our attention to inclusion, that like warm and fuzzy, because it elicits all those warm, fuzzy feelings like the youngest, child in the family. I also think it's because of like our field fascination with acronyms, and that DIE would have been really bad, right? Like, so
and I think Jordan Peterson kind of co-opted that and sort of weaponized it against the field as well. So yeah, I see how that it doesn't really flow off the tongue so well.
Yeah. So we talk a lot at Brevity Wit about accessibility, and sometimes we use the acronym IDEA, IDEA, but I also describe myself as acronym agnostic, because I was like, that the fight over the acronym is not where this work needs to happen, right? Like, I was like, that's not the most important part. And I think when it comes to equity, I think it gets skipped over or misunderstood or ignored, because when you're talking about equity, you're fundamentally talking about systems. Mm-hmm. And systems are complex and don't really care what your feelings are, but it can kind of make your head hurt, yep. Which is, and I don't actually think that most people have system sight. I think what systems of oppression are very good at is actually making themselves invisible. Because when you make the system invisible, people tend to think this is just the natural order of things.
Right.
And so then there's no volition to change them, because they think, well, this is just how the world evolved, without any understanding of whose fingerprints are on the design. Right?
Yeah. That's really interesting. So maybe for folks who are like, okay, so tell me what this looks like, or what are some of the ways that inequity sort of gets embedded within systems and we don't realize that they're there? Is there an example that sort of comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, well, we can look at like, just the 40-hour work week, right? Like just what knowledge work looks like now. So most like knowledge workers, most offices, particularly in the 1950s, were really designed for like white, heterosexual, Christian, able-bodied men who, one, had somebody at home picking up all of the cognitive and emotional labor for free, and then could commute from the suburbs, and one income could get you a house, pay for retirement, and pay for your kids' education, right, to college. That lifestyle doesn't exist for most people anymore, including straight, white, able-bodied Christian men, right? Like that's not a thing, right? But the legacy of that design continues, except that salaries have not kept up. So one income doesn't like help a household. So like when women enter the workforce, they're like, okay, well, if you can have two incomes, then we don't need to increase either one. Right. So now we became a household where two incomes are almost a necessity. So then what happens after that is that it becomes very hard for single people to like have a full-time job and pay rent and live on their own. Right. It becomes very hard for single people to start a business. Like I wrote a book during the pandemic and I started my business before the pandemic, but I was able to really commit to it full time. That's fundamentally because one, I don't have children that I had to homeschool during the pandemic. And I had a husband who I was able to get on his health insurance, and he has a union backed job, and he did all the housework while I wrote.
Right.
Now, some people say, well, then, like you're really lucky, and that's true. But my ability to get married has zero correlation to my writing chops or my ability to start a business and make it successful.
Right.
So imagine how many single people's talent we're losing out on by nature of the fact that like health, insurance is dependent on our job, that it requires two incomes to keep a roof over our head that's like safe and clean and healthy, like how many people's creativity are we losing out on because of how we've like what we assume is the average family when that's not even true. And so what equity is really asking people to keep in mind is that people have differences. And if we design multiple options for people according to those differences, everybody then has a fair shot of contributing their strengths and contributing their talent to society. But when we don't have equitable structures, it doesn't matter how talented you are because the system is not supporting your success.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is that people often conflate equity with equality. So then it's like, okay, so we're just going to, what, if that's not working, then, companies say, all right, well, let's just move to a 4-day work week, or they start to sort of make broad strokes. And so, for those who are sort of like, that seems fair, right?
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes that fair piece gets misunderstood as well. It's about creating fairness and what does that look like? And people are like, okay, well, we'll set this baseline and it'll be fair for everyone. So what doesn't that get right then in terms of sort of equity versus equality?
Yeah, so I started changing my language that it's not equity versus equality, it's equity and equality, that they are two sides of the same coin, because you actually do need both. You can't throw out one just for the other. And the reason I say that is because in the early 2000s and like the late 1990s, the early 2000s, there was a push amongst LGBTQ advocates for civil unions as an alternative to marriage, right? That would protect the legal rights of same-sex couples. And then they all got together and they realized that what that was going to create was basically a separate but unequal state, like which the Supreme Court decided in Brown versus the Board of Education is not just. Right. And so they went for marriage equality because everyone should have equal access to the privileges of marriage. And so what I often say is like, we need equitable structures in order to have equal access to opportunity and equal human rights. So the goal is somewhat equality, but you need equity to get there. Right? Like that equal access to marriage doesn't mean that you don't need equitable things. Like you need, wedding vendors who know how to like, light and dress and frame like two people of the same gender, right? That don't have to go into gender roles. You may need something different to get there, but that the goal is actually equality for all.
I think that's sort of that missing nuance there then. And so we don't have to throw that baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, and that's where that nuance I think comes in when we're talking about, when we just sort of let diversity, equity, inclusion roll off our tongue. We're sort of missing how these things interrelate and interconnect. So what pushed you to write your book? Because, it's always interesting. I wrote a dissertation and it was the longest slog of my life. So I'm always interested in people who are inspired to write books because I found it, it's a fun endeavor. I love the research. I like, I just like the writing part of it. But because I think it is interesting that this was sort of a topic that drew you to it, and sort of I like the idea that it's, let me just grab the title. So how to design organization where everyone thrives, and that equity is that central piece. So I'd love to just hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I will say that I'm a PhD dropout, so I totally get dissertations being a slog. Mine was probably reversed. Like the research was kind of just like very minute and boring. And I was like, the writing part, like I'm like, great, because I think my attraction to psychology and social sciences is how can you take all of this really great knowledge and apply it? It was the application that was most interesting. And I think what drew me to writing this book is because at that time when I was writing it, very few people were talking about equity. This is pre-George Floyd, before this was really on people's radar. And then I was like, yeah, I get the inclusion part, but if we're not changing the system, then we're making it, what we're asking is for everybody to be the best human being possible. And I was like, that's not scalable. Like people are overworked and tired and but if you change the system, you change everything, right? And so how do you start to change the system? And also, I think I had a very good sense early on that of how the system actually affects individuals. And this is actually one of the bigger reasons why I left my grad school is psychology at the time was not able to account for how the system was causing psychopathology. Right? How racism causes depression and mental illness, how sexism causes agoraphobia and other mental illness. You know what I mean? Like how all of the isms and phobias really impact an individual at a core level. And instead they were looking to the individual to fault them with their genes or their upbringing. And not that genes and upbringing don't play a role, but there are no independent, dependent variables in the real world.
Right.
Right? Like everything is a feedback loop and everything affects one, we're all interdependent. Right. And I think I had the intuition of that. And I think what this book was me trying to put that into word, like something that I knew viscerally and I wanted to put it into words somehow.
I think that's really neat. Yeah. I mean, I am a failed psychologist because I loved the research, right? Yeah. And I was actually just really interested in the history of psychology and its impact on so many of the systems today, right? So I got really interested in sort of the standardized tests and what that meant. And, I mean, they're very racialized and how they were weaponized against, in particular, at the time that I was doing research on Black Americans in the early 19th century. So and then someone gently said, like, I think history is kind of more your thing, and so I said, yeah, I'll stay there. So that's how I didn't go into psychology, but probably for the best. So how does all of this sort of translate to the work that you do with Brevity of Wit? Because I know that you use human-centered design and you bring all of this to this. So what does this look like when you're working with organizations and helping them to sort of think about the systems and their impact on people? How do you operationalize that?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things I think is really the watchword now in DEI is like under promise and over deliver. Like I think people like this whole like very American entrepreneurial macho thing of like world domination that doesn't work in the DEI space. Like your company single-handedly isn't going to end systemic racism. That needs to be an interdependent effort, right? So like get on board with the effort and the movement, but then scale it down to what you actually have the power to influence. Right. So that depends on the size of your organization, the industry that you're in, so on and so forth. And then even as individuals, that will depend on what's your power within the organization, who reports to you, what is your field. Like so many times I have like, communications departments coming to us and, they'll be like, well, the problem really isn't the comms. It's that like our events aren't diverse enough, but that's the events department. I was like, well, you don't have the power to change that, right? Yeah. Like you got to focus on what's yours to own on some level. And so in our work with organizations, we start by really with a three-pronged structure that's from the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Benchmarks, which was a theory of change created by 112 expert panelists that's genuinely global on how to do this work. And they talk about, one, setting a really clear vision for this work. What is the end state? How is the organization going to look different? Like what problem is your organization solving that requires DEI to be embedded in it? Right. So being really clear, how does this work apply? Because also the other thing is that people are like, we should address, it'll be a consulting firm in like aeronautics that's like, we should address like medical racism. And I was like, no, you shouldn't.
Yeah.
You don't know anything about it. Like, you don't need to have an ERG on medical racism. That's not like where you need to be, right?
Yeah.
And then the second part of that three-part structure is leadership development, making sure that leaders are really bought in. And the importance for this is because organizations are not organized the same as democracies. In that, in a democracy, like, we can vote out our president. So because of like we fundamentally have a belief in one person, one vote, even though there are threats to that, there's a grassroots movement that can be really effective. And that sort of social justice organizing is really important for our societies. The more engaged you are in civics and in your community, the healthier a democracy it'll be. When it comes to organizations, like, the staff doesn't vote out the CEO.
Right.
Right. So if the leadership isn't isn't really bought into this work, even the best efforts are going to get stymied. And the reason, and that's not healthy, because what that often leads to is actually people of color or people of other marginalized identities being tasked with something that's fundamentally impossible.
Yeah.
And that you are setting them up for failure. And that is an injustice in of itself. So even though I know sometimes there are people who are very passionate about having staff involvement, and staff involvement is important, we also always start with leadership, because I'm trying to, pressure test how ready is your leadership, and also how skilled are they at managing change. Mm-hmm. Change management is a leadership skill, but not everybody has been taught that. And if you haven't been taught it, then what you're going to do is just introduce chaos into your organization and not be able to manage it. And people are going to get harmed in that process, right? So leadership development is the second pillar, because it also directly affects like harm reduction for marginalized communities. And then the third pillar is structure, meaning what are the people, money, and time dedicated to this effort? And your vision should match your structure, right? So a lot of times people come to me with this grandiose vision or this very like 55-point strategic plan. And I was like, okay, so how many people are in charge of executing this? And they're like, one with like a budget of 20,000. I was like, so then that's not happening.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and that's getting down to that whole like under promise, but over deliver, right? Like, your structure and your vision need to be aligned so that you can actually deliver on certain things, because delivering on one thing well is what allows you to build trust, rather than promising 20 things and like only delivering on 5, right? Like, trust is built by being able to be honest about what you can do and what you can't do.
So the other thing I think that's really important, what I wanted to sort of pick up on there is that, pick those things that you can do well and that you can deliver on. Now, what about those times when you're going into organizations and, they're like, well, we've been asking for this forever. And, how do we get to these like few things that, we can do, and how do we prioritize the many things that we want, and knowing that change does take time. And I think there's often that like, that tension between wanting to do this well, which it needs to be done because this is like an organizational culture change management efforts that this doesn't happen overnight, but also sort of the feeling, or maybe that it's got to get done because it's been so long, right? Like that impatience. I don't know if you find that, but I find it's a tough
thing to negotiate, and it requires some amount of humility, because sometimes I think it tends to, not always, but it tends to also fall along generational lines. And I get it with the younger generation, because I think they're looking at the older generation like, what the hell were you all doing? Mm-hmm. Like, we have climate change, we have school shootings, like you're not acting like adults who are in charge. Yeah. So get out of the way and I'll do this quicker. And I get that. I get that sentiment. It's a justified sentiment. And at the same time, the person I learned this work from, my mentor, Janetta Betch-Cole, she was born like in Jim Crow South. She's now in her 80s and she's lived through some things. And if she, I was just telling a story today that she was the first African-American woman president of Spelman College in 1987, which is late for a college of all Black women. And when she joined, she tried to create a gay student center. She was very close friends with Audre Lorde and James Baldwin and really wanted to push LGBT acceptance at the university, or at the college rather. And there was a lot of pushback. Spelman was founded like with Christian values. The Black church has been a huge source of resilience for a lot of Black people. It was really complicated. That being said, 30 years later, Spelman was the second HBCU to admit transgender students, and the first was Bennett, where she had also served as president.
Okay.
And so I hear young folks, but then I have to look to my elders and be like, look at what she did. She planted seeds for a tree she never got to sit under, right? Like she's still alive, but she's not president of the college. She doesn't get to claim that as a victory, but it's absolutely because of the hard work she did in 1987, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so my patience comes from my respect for my elders. Right? That they try, they really had to forge a path where there was none. And so I think impatience is sometimes disrespectful of how much patience they had in order to make the world a bit better for us. At the same time, I hear the need that, like, listen, there's a lot of stuff going really wrong, and we can't afford to just be like incrementalists, or like just go for low-hanging fruit.
Right.
Like what we want to go for is like the most impactful fruit. Right. So what I'm trying to do is figure out what is how can we narrow this down into something that you can address, but also something that's important and impactful, not the easiest thing to address. Right.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting, because I think a lot of folks go for the quick wins, which I know sometimes you need to do that, but I love that, the most impactful fruit. I don't think you can find that in a grocery store, but that's a really, really interesting way to think about it. When I was in grad school, everything sort of had changed to looking at history and looking at the Black freedom struggle as the long Black freedom struggle, right? Like that this is continuing, and it didn't start in the 50s and 60s, and that there are longer roots, and looking at this as something that has happened over time, and sort of, as you mentioned, they're just sort of the different seeds that were planted that previous generations didn't get to see, the fruits of their labor, but laid the groundwork for massive change to happen. And I think that's really, really interesting to consider. And, even when we put it in an organizational context, is that some of these seeds that are being planted now, while they may not, come to fruition under your tenure, if you're a leader, but knowing that you're doing the right thing at this moment, that will eventually start to bear fruit, as things shift and change.
Yeah. And going for results is important, but it's also important to understand that systems of oppression evolve.
Yeah.
And so what is needed is people with the muscles to continue to do the right thing in the face of enormous pressure, right? So how do I want to say? So like after segregation, when we desegregated schools and Brown versus Board of Education, that's not the end of the story. Like, because that there were unintended consequences of that. Now, like what happened is that like the entire Black teaching class got gutted because nobody would hire Black teachers. They didn't go and fund Black schools. They forced Black kids into white schools where there were profound negative impacts as well. And so that doesn't mean that integration shouldn't have happened, but it means that when we start to think of things as like, oh, Supreme Court ruling, victory, mission accomplished, we don't develop the skills to continue to nurture justice fundamentally, right? Mm-hmm. That the skill that's needed is the skill that allows you to nurture inclusion and justice and equality over the course of your lifetime. It is not a project plan that you get to put on your resume, right? And so if you think of it as a life skill that's needed, instead of like getting a college degree or a PhD or like finishing your dissertation, right? Then your approach to it is different, because then you're able to sort of inhale and exhale. Right? You're like, okay, I'm going to work on it this week, and then I'm going to go on vacation. And it's okay if you don't think about like the world's problems for 7 days, right? And then you come back rejuvenated and you engage again. And so we need people who are willing to nurture these seeds that have been planted and plant their own seeds. We don't need people who are drill sergeants yelling at seedlings to grow faster.
Yeah.
Like that's not helping anything, right?
Yeah.
So some of this is, as much as I love talking about systems, some of this is also changing our approach to the world and what we think success is. Like success is being somebody who is tending to the better sides of our nature over their lifetime.
Yeah, and I think I often worry about when folks are hiring chief diversity officers or they're hiring in-house, the enormous weight and pressure and the hopes and the dreams that they set for folks. But also I often worry that they're setting them up for failure because it is too much work for one person to do.
Yeah.
And the one thing that I think also doesn't get talked about, and I think why systems of oppression shift and change is that power and how tightly folks who hold power hold on to it and are able to find ways to maintain it. That makes it challenging as well. And that's a word that doesn't often get talked about as much. I mean, it does in certain circles, but
I mean, DEI fundamentally comes down to power, and
it's a dirty word that not everyone.
I know. I have a talk.
It's like a Trojan horse, right? You get in with DEI, and then you start distributing power, start dismantling.
I know. But I have a talk on power, money, and time as the building blocks of equity, and it totally everybody gets super scared, right? Like they're like, shit, you're going to talk about money and power? Time, somehow they're willing to, but then when I start talking about it, they're like, oh no, you're talking about it differently. Now I'm scared of it, right?
Yeah.
And power for me is I don't think power is a dirty word. So the way I often talk about it is there's fundamentally two approaches to how you use your power. Mm-hmm. There's the supremacist approach, which is taking more than one share, and it's about controlling, exploiting, extracting, dominating, oppressing, any of those sorts of behaviors. And then there's a liberatory approach to power, which recognizes differences as strengths, and it's about connecting, healing, and repairing our world, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's the fundamental shift that people need to be everybody has power. We all have different types of power, different levels of power, but are you using your power in a way that's connecting, repairing, and healing the world? And I think this is what sometimes people who say that they are allies or advocates for DEI, but are impatient or in their approach, unconsciously fall into supremacist uses of power to fight for what they think is right. And that's problematic because the shift needs to be in how you're using power. Mm-hmm. Right? And it's a hard thing to sort of show people and teach them because they're doing it out of the best of intentions, and they just can't see that their approach is actually causing harm while advocating for something that's good and virtuous.
Now I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time after this. I'm guessing a lot of my listeners are thinking, there's okay, that's deep.
I know.
But it is. I mean, I think that is definitely right. But I really love that distinction because I think, power has been seen as you mentioned, I've seen it as, a dirty word, but I love the idea that yes, you can come at it from the supremacist side or liberatory, where it's, I think, much more useful to think about it in that way and to not be so scared of it, because most people think that I have to give up my power.
No. Right.
And so I think that's that supremacist model, well, I have this and I don't want to lose it. And so.
Yeah. Well, and you can't, I mean, how can you as a white woman give up you can't give your power to me, but you could use it more responsibly.
Yeah.
You could use it in a way that's much more about connecting and repairing and healing the world than in a way that's oppressing people. Right.
Yes.
So I don't think even when it comes to any sort of privilege, there are certain privileges that need to be given up. If you're a CEO who makes 300 times what your lowest paid employee makes, you need to give some things up.
Yeah.
But generally, I don't think people need to give up their privilege. They have to use it more skillfully.
Yeah. Yeah, well, no, absolutely. I agree. And I think, I think that's one of the things that I sort of learned going through this work is that I cannot give up my privilege, but there are ways that I can, use it as a way to support and amplify and advocate for the work of others. And that's kind of what one of the goals of this podcast has been, is to sort of use, the power and the position that I have is to learn and to also, share the different perspectives and to push folks in the way that they think about this work as well. And it's been sort of the one of the greatest joys of this podcast is to sort of be able to, to share the knowledge and the work that other folks are doing in this field and who are making, massive impacts and sort of, shaking it up, which I love. And which is why I was really excited to have you on the show, because I knew it was going to sort of be a shakeup, which is what I love.
Well, good. I'm good at that. So I'm glad that my strengths are welcomed here, not always.
No, I think it's, it is. It's so important to be, to not be complacent. Like this is a learning journey, right? All of this is about continuing to learn and rethink things. Before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, if there's one thing that our listeners could take away from our conversation today, what would that be? What would you like people to take away?
I think that no matter what your position is in the world, no matter how big or small your organization is, no matter how big or small your job is, you actually do have the power to connect, repair, and heal the world. You have it. You got to be creative sometimes, and you got to think about it a little bit deeply and a little bit differently than you might have been taught. But there are definite ways that you can use yourself in connecting with other people, repairing relationships, healing things that have been broken in this world. And maybe don't start with your family, start somewhere else, because I know family stuff can be difficult. But don't ever think that like you don't have the power to impact or to use your power in a liberatory fashion. And the more people we get who reorient how they use power, the more impact we'll have in the world and creating a just and fair world for everyone.
There's not much more I can add to that. Thank you so much. And for those who are interested in learning more about you and about your work or want to keep up with you, where should they go?
Yeah. So my company's name is Brevity Wit. So you can find us at brevityandwit.com. My book, Equity, is available wherever books are sold. I am the only Minal Bopaiah on the internet, so you can find me. I'm really active on LinkedIn. And actually, if you go to the URL, theequitybook.com, you can not only buy the book, but we have a toolkit with like other resources if you're interested in that.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. I'm so grateful that you shared your time and your knowledge with us. So, Minal, thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa.
And for those of you listening, if you have your own questions or if you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Until next time, I'm Dr. Melissa Horne, and this is Just One Q.